Hello and welcome to this short talk on Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. I'm Kate Walchester and I'm subject leader for English at Liverpool John Moores University. In this talk, what I'd like to do is to address the question of why I don't think this story is a love story, despite its iconic status as such. And I'm going to be addressing this question by thinking about the historical and the geographical context of Wuthering Heights. Okay, so we're going to go back to the Victorian period and think first of all about the reception of Wuthering Heights. The Victorian audience didn't make much of Wuthering Heights, as you can see from this example from a periodical, a journal of the period, Graham's Magazine. Reviewers, this is fairly typical in that reviewers gave it a very mixed, mostly negative response. This particular reviewer can't understand how anyone could write such a dark text and worries about the violent nature of the audience for which it might have been written. And don't forget that this audience, these reviewers, did not know that Emily Brontë was the author. They did not know that this had been written by the daughter of a Church of England priest, as the text had been published under the pseudonym Ellis Bell. So why did that Victorian audience regard this text so negatively? What was it about it that was so unsettling? Well, I think perhaps we might have found the same sort of response on our first reading of the text. It's a difficult text. It's very complicated in terms of its narration. We have multiple narrators, all who are embedded and enmeshed in this story emotionally. And it's very difficult to tell whose truth we should believe and which version of events is the most reliable. And so it's an unsettling text. We're asked to make our own minds up about this complicated and very emotive story. And so you can see how the Victorian audience, for whom this would have been a very unusual text, it doesn't sit well with the other examples of novels with which they may have been familiar. Here you can see some criticism written in the 1970s, a very early criticism by Arnold Kettle, and his emphasis here is very much that this is a text which is rooted in its historical context. He says that Heathcliff was not an abstract Byronic hero, so not someone who we'd associated with romance and glamour, but one who came out of a slum, a Liverpool slum, so very ordinary, a very poor background, and that this is not an abstract text about love. Rather, it is about ordinary people, it's about property ownership, and it's about the availability of education, and about the way in which marriages secured property and some level of security particularly for women. And this taps into something we consider important through all our undergraduate programme at John Moores, and that is the historicity of texts, how texts come out of their historical and social contexts. Equally, we're interested in the textuality of history, so we can see here that Wuthering Heights tells us a lot. It gives us those surviving textual traces of what life was like for the Victorians, what things did affect their lives and lifestyles. I'm going to go on to talk about Cathy. So the main female protagonist, Cathy, in the first half of this text, her life, her choices are, I would argue, intimately bound up with the situation of femininity, of being a woman in the 1840s. So life, the laws, the situation is affected by the period. I'm going to introduce you to an important critical text about women's writing, written in the 1970s by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. It's called The Mad Woman in the Attic. The Mad Woman, of course, refers to Bertha Mason, who is the first wife in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and she's the one who's locked in the attic. The text as a whole talks about many different important novels by women, and in the particular chapter which deals with Wuthering Heights, Gilbert and Gubar see Wuthering Heights as a feminist rewriting of John Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1667. Milton's Paradise Lost addresses the fall from grace, the expulsion of Eve and Adam from the Garden of Eden due to Eve's treacherous taking of the apple. Gilbert and Gubar see Wuthering Heights as a rewriting, so it's about Cathy's expulsion from the paradise of her childhood. They see her as having a wonderful childhood in which she is free to make choices, to move around as she wishes, to play outside on the moors with Heathcliff, and this changes into her being confined and constrained into the role of a lady after her period spent at Thrushcross Grange. Gilbert and Gubar also see Wuthering Heights as a subversion, a challenge to the established novel of development, which we might call the Bildungsroman. Other examples of Bildungsroman are the texts like Oliver Twist or Huckleberry Finn, for example. And as you can see from those examples, Bildungsroman generally address the development of a young man, and here obviously we have Cathy, and it's a subversion because in those texts the young man is seen to gain freedom and gain power and in their development and in their adolescence, whereas in Cathy's situation she becomes more confined, more constrained as she takes on that role of being a Victorian lady. Cathy's choices are essentially, I would argue, constrained by the married woman's situation in the 1840s, which is that women couldn't own or inherit property, only as a widow. And so Cathy is not going to inherit Wuthering Heights. She's the daughter, and unless she marries well, she is going to have a very precarious economic life, and she's not even going to have the status which she has at Wuthering Heights, and so she has to marry well. It wasn't until, as you can see here, 1882 that women were allowed to own their own property, and so Cathy has to marry well, and this, I would argue, addresses her choice in choosing Linton over Heathcliff, and choosing that life of social status associated with Thrushcross Grange rather than with Wuthering Heights. So she's aspiring to take a step up the ladder, as you can see here, to the Grange and the land of the place of the landed gentry, people who, although the inhabitants aren't aristocracy here, they have titles. They don't have titles. They have property which they can rent out and earn money through rents. Whereas at the Heights, their income comes from the land. They own the Earnshaws own Wuthering Heights. They're yeoman farmers, and they earn their money from tilling the land, growing crops, and also having stock, having animals. And so also at Wuthering Heights we see characters such as Joseph and Nellie, the servants, as well as the labourers and the people who work for those farmers, the Earnshaws. So Cathy's choices are bound up with that kind of very established sense of class, and she's trying to secure her own future to some extent. That said, about established class basis, we can see here from the list of different events and concerns of the 1840s that this is a time of great upheaval. time when thinkers such as Marx and Engels are considering class, thinking about its implications. And also we have many challenges. So we have the potato famine in Ireland, and a lot of unrest about laws and the political situation for people who didn't own their own piece of land. So you couldn't vote until after the Reform Act and the fights of the Chartists. And so this is a time of class unrest, and it's a time in which people are considering their own status in society. And that's why I think Heathcliff is such an important character in this, and the way that he moves through classes and the way in which he is able to use those laws and use those advances which had always been used by the upper classes in Britain, so ideas about inheritance and marriage, and he uses those to his advantage so that in the end he gains both properties. This slide shows you a view from the graveyard of Haworth, the Yorkshire village, the Yorkshire town in which the Brontes lived, and towards the parsonage where Emily Brontë and her family lived. And this is an important slide because it highlights the proximity in which Emily Brontë was living to the graveyard, and the way in which she would be surrounded and reminded on a daily basis of the poverty which surrounded her in the town. It's an important graveyard because it was the subject in 1850 of a government report by Benjamin Herschel Babbage in 1850, where he concluded that the situation in terms of drinking water in Haworth was unsanitary, and that the people were effectively being poisoned by contaminated drinking water, because the water that they were drinking was filtering off the moors through this graveyard, which, because of high infant mortality, high death rates, had over 42,000 bodies in it. This just a small churchyard. The water was running through that churchyard, and the people were drinking it and getting diseases like cholera and dysentery and dying unnaturally early. And so Brontë is reminded of this, reminded of poverty and death and darkness, and I think this is another reason why the text is such a dark text. It's one in which death and the precarity of life is highlighted all the way through. And finally, I want to consider race. Heathcliff's character, I've talked about the way in which he moves through classes, but he also might be seen as a symbol of a challenge to Victorian imperialism. So he's an outsider. He comes from a Liverpool slum, and he's brought back to that Yorkshire village. And some critics, such as Susan Mayer here and Patsy Stoneman, have seen Heathcliff as a symbol of reverse colonisation. So that idea of reversing what Britain was doing around the globe, sending out subjects to take over other countries and other areas, and that Heathcliff is a symbol of the reverse of that. The outsider, the dark fear of Victorian imperialists was that the same could happen to Britain, that other countries, other outsiders could come into Britain and take over here. And what Mayer and Stoneman are arguing is that Heathcliff is Emily Bronte's way of showing that, and showing the unsettled events that happen, and the challenge to the established class base when the outsider comes in and shakes up that stayed basis. Okay, so hopefully what I've done is talked about the way in which Wuthering Heights is a product very much of its context. I wanted to highlight how gender is linked to power and control through Cathy's choices. She has to make informed choices about who she's going to marry in order to secure her life and her position. This is a novel that shows how class position can be challenged and subverted by Heathcliff, and how we might see Heathcliff as a symbol of that reversal of Britain's imperial struggles and the fears which underlay those events of imperialism in the 19th century. And if you were concerned that you're finding this a very difficult and confusing text, I think we need to take solace that this is indeed a very difficult text, and that lots of critics over the years have highlighted the fact. And here is a final quotation from Carol Jacobs, in which she asserts that there is no centre to Wuthering Heights, there is no truth. It's all a dream. It's all very difficult to pin down. And so I think the most we can hope for is that you enjoy the text and you enjoy its complexities and you enjoy the way in which it represents both the love story perhaps and its historical context.